Picture it, the sovereign ruler of England, once praised for his beauty and vitality, now a grotesque figure of human suffering. The scent of decay wafts through corridors long before he enters, and the sounds of his pain echo through stone halls. This was Henry VIII at the end, not the majestic monarch of royal portraits, but a bloated, ulcerated, bedridden man, screaming in agony and haunting the memories of all who surrounded him. His death wasn't only the physical expiration of a man, it was the symbolic collapse of the illusion of invincible kingship. It's a tale soaked in blood, sweat, rot, and retribution, and one that defines the mortal limits of even the most absolute power. But why should we dwell on this? Because in his demise we find an uncomfortable mirror, a reminder that power does not grant immunity to pain, and authority cannot erase mortality. Henry VIII was the embodiment of Renaissance absolutism, larger than life, feared, admired, and obsessed with legacy. And yet, as his body withered and his mind unraveled, so too did the myth he had so carefully constructed. The end of Henry VIII is not merely a historical curiosity, it is a moral reckoning. It challenges us to look beyond royal titles and velvet crowns, and to see the raw, unfiltered truth of what lies beneath. His story, however grotesque, is essential. It shows us that decay, both physical and moral, is the final equalizer. Henry VIII was not born to be king, but fate had other plans. Born on June 28, 1491 at Greenwich Palace, Henry Tudor was the second son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. His early life was relatively quiet for a royal prince. The spotlight was always on his elder brother Arthur, the heir to the Tudor throne. It was Arthur who was educated for kingship, trained in diplomacy, and married off to the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon. Young Henry, meanwhile, was destined for the church and received an education that emphasized theology, classical languages, music, and debate. But when Arthur died suddenly in 1502 at the age of 15, everything changed. At just 10 years old, Henry became heir apparent. The pressure of unexpected destiny now weighed heavily on his shoulders. By the time he ascended the throne in 1509 at the age of 17, following the death of his father, the mood in England had shifted. After decades of civil war and political uncertainty, Henry VIII was seen as a symbol of renewal. Tall and broad-shouldered, with striking red-gold hair and commanding blue eyes, he radiated vitality and charisma. Foreign ambassadors could not contain their admiration. A Venetian envoy wrote, "His Majesty is the most handsome prince I ever saw." More than just a figurehead, young Henry was the embodiment of Renaissance ideals. He was athletic, intellectually curious, and deeply engaged in matters of state. He wrote poetry and music, hunted with unrivaled skill, debated scholars in Latin, and took pride in both his physical prowess and scholarly mind. His education, once intended for a religious life, gave him the rhetorical edge of a theologian, one he would later use to justify radical decisions. The early years of his reign were marked by optimism. He reinvigorated the royal court, surrounding himself with humanist scholars, artists, and thinkers. He revived court pageantry and tournaments, reinforcing a chivalric image of himself as a warrior king. Henry was not only powerful, but popular. In June 1509, just 2 months after becoming king, he married Catherine of Aragon, the widow of his brother. The match was politically sound and religiously sanctioned, with a papal dispensation ensuring its legitimacy. Catherine was intelligent, devout, and initially loved by both Henry and the people. For a time, they were a celebrated couple, the Golden King and his dignified Spanish queen. But beneath this glittering surface, cracks had already begun to form. Henry's temperament, though concealed by youthful vigor, harbored impatience and a need for control. He sought glory not just through peace, but through war. His early military expeditions against France were driven more by personal ambition than strategic necessity. He longed to emulate Henry VIII and win fame on the battlefield. Though some campaigns had limited success, they also revealed Henry's impatience with political process and his growing distaste for advisors who disagreed with him. Even more pressing was the matter of succession. Between 1510 and 1518, Catherine suffered multiple miscarriages and infant deaths. Only one child, Mary, survived. The lack of a male heir began to haunt Henry. Dynastic security was paramount in Tudor England. Henry knew all too well that civil war could return if a clear line of succession was not established. This anxiety grew into obsession. Though Henry still presented the image of a gallant Renaissance monarch, his inner world began to darken with frustration. Behind the tapestries and feasts, the king brooded over fate. Why had God denied him a son? Was the marriage cursed? Was the papal dispensation that allowed him to marry Catherine invalid in the eyes of heaven? Thus began the slow transformation from admired prince to anxious ruler, and from charismatic husband to a man willing to tear a nation apart in pursuit of a male heir. The early glow of Henry's reign, so full of potential, would gradually be replaced by shadow. But in 1509, no one could imagine that this dazzling monarch would one day become a grotesque symbol of rot and repression. Henry VIII's beginnings were not just golden, they were almost mythical. And perhaps that's why his fall would become one of the most cautionary tales in royal history. By the 1530s, Henry VIII was no longer the vibrant prince of his youth, but he still clung fiercely to the image of a virile, indomitable king. Now in his mid-40s, he remained physically active, particularly in martial sports. Jousting was more than a hobby, it was a display of strength, dominance, and chivalric identity. To withdraw from the list would have been to admit weakness. On January 24, 1536, during a jousting tournament at Greenwich Palace, disaster struck. Henry, fully armored, took to the field with the confidence of a much younger man. As the trumpets blared and the crowd watched his opponent's lance struck with force, accounts vary as to whether the lance hit the king or if the real injury came when his horse, possibly startled, buckled and collapsed on top of him. Either way, the result was catastrophic. Henry was thrown violently to the ground and crushed beneath his steed. He lay motionless. Eyewitnesses panicked. For 2 hours, the King of England was unconscious. Courtiers feared the worst. It's not an exaggeration to say that in those moments, the fate of a kingdom hung in the balance. With no surviving male heir, a sudden royal death could have plunged England into civil unrest, the very thing the Tudors had fought to prevent. But Henry awoke. Physically, he had survived. Emotionally, psychologically, and neurologically, something had shifted forever. The most visible injury was to his leg. The damage failed to heal properly, and over the coming weeks developed into an ulcer. It festered continuously, refusing to close. In an age with no understanding of infection or circulation, the treatments only made things worse. Physicians applied salves made from mercury, cauterized the wound with red-hot irons, and wrapped it tightly in cloths soaked in vinegar and herbs. But the ulcer spread. It emitted a putrid smell that became legendary in court. People knew the king was approaching by scent alone. Modern historians and medical experts now speculate that Henry may have suffered a closed head injury during the accident, a traumatic brain injury that affected his behavior. His rages became more volatile, his decisions more erratic. His paranoia deepened. In the months and years following the accident, Henry began a descent into psychological darkness that matched his physical decline. And 1536 was a pivotal year for another reason. It was the year he ordered the execution of his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Just 4 months after the accident, Anne was charged with adultery, incest, and treason, most of it based on flimsy or fabricated evidence. Whether the accident exacerbated existing resentment or destabilized Henry's mind, the outcome was clear: the Golden Prince was no longer in control of his better nature. The court began to change. A culture of fear and flattery replaced the vibrancy of his youth. Ministers became sycophants. Servants watched their words. Advisors were chosen not for talent, but for obedience. Those who disagreed with the king often found themselves imprisoned, or worse. Henry's public appearances declined as the leg injury worsened. The athletic king who once dazzled Europe now needed assistance to walk. Eventually, he would be hoisted between rooms by mechanical pulleys. The man who once embodied the ideal of manly perfection had become a monarch in decline, but a decline no one dared name aloud. The jousting accident of 1536 did not kill Henry VIII, but in many ways it marked the beginning of the end. It shattered not only bone but image. It turned a proud king into a wounded sovereign one whose pain, rage, and pride would rewrite the destiny of England. The king who once danced with nobles, hunted with vigor, and dazzled ambassadors with his athletic grace was now barely recognizable. In the aftermath of the jousting accident, Henry VIII's body began a slow, grotesque rebellion. As the ulcer on his leg worsened, an infection set in. The physical degeneration that followed was not only medically tragic, it was symbolically catastrophic for a monarch who had built his rule on power, image, and control. By the early 1540s, Henry was obese, immobile, and in constant pain. The leg wound, far from healing, had become a chronic ulcerated sore that oozed pus and emitted a stench that permeated his chambers. The injury was likely compounded by circulatory problems, possibly caused by type 2 diabetes or peripheral artery disease conditions unknown to 16th century medicine. Tudor medical practices did more harm than good. In an age before antibiotics, antiseptics, or germ theory, royal physicians relied on ancient Galenic methods. Bloodletting was routinely used to balance the humors, a theory based on bodily fluids. Cauterization was performed using scalding iron rods, which caused intense pain but did nothing to halt the spread of infection. Poultices made from animal fat, vinegar, and mercury were slathered onto the king's leg, substances that, while meant to cleanse, often introduced new toxins. These treatments weakened Henry further. He became prone to high fevers, chills, and fatigue. He frequently suffered migraines and dizzy spells. His breath came in wheezing gasps, especially after meals, and his bloated body could no longer endure the tight regalia of state. His once regal suits of armor were re-engineered yearly to accommodate his swelling girth, some of them so wide at the waist they looked almost comical, a parody of the man he had once been. By the mid-1540s, it's estimated that Henry's waist measured over 54 inches. His weight likely exceeded 400 pounds. He could not walk unaided and required a custom-built mechanical hoist to move between rooms and onto his horse when he still rode at all. The palace staff constructed ramps, widened doorways, and reinforced chairs to accommodate his size. But perhaps more humiliating than the architectural modifications was the fact that Henry could no longer bathe himself or clean his own wounds. His personal attendants were tasked with tending to the ulcers, changing his bandages, and disposing of the pus-stained cloths. The sheer volume of waste and the persistent, sickly sweet odor of rot clung to him. Courtiers were expected to remain stone-faced in his presence, never flinching or recoiling, even as the king's very body became a spectacle of disease and decline. Henry, once obsessively proud of his appearance, became increasingly isolated. Mirrors were covered. Portraits from this era were idealized, presenting a strong, squared-off monarch, rather than the truth, a decaying, barely mobile man confined by pain, plagued by shame, and trapped within a failing body. The dissonance between image and reality grew wider with every passing month, and yet Henry remained king. He continued to legislate, to marry, to execute, and to fight wars. But everything he did was now filtered through a body in revolt, one that dulled his mind, inflamed his temper, and weakened his resolve. Pain shaped his politics. Discomfort fed his paranoia. His inability to control his own flesh mirrored his increasing inability to govern without cruelty or fear. The body that had once been England's pride was now its shame. And for Henry himself, it was a daily battlefield, a war he was losing inch by inch, wound by wound, until even his most loyal servants could barely mask their pity. If Henry the Waste's body had turned against him, so too had his mind. The physical pain he endured daily, the open sores, the bloated organs, the throbbing migraines, was not confined to the flesh. It seeped into his psyche, distorting his judgment, fraying his temper, and turning the once celebrated Renaissance prince into a monarch feared not for his wisdom, but for his unpredictability. The fall at Greenwich in 1536 may have damaged more than his leg. Many modern neurologists believe that Henry suffered a traumatic brain injury that permanently altered his personality. Symptoms such as violent mood swings, impulsivity, aggression, and paranoia became more pronounced in the years that followed. This shift in temperament was not lost on contemporaries, though few dared speak openly of it. The once jovial king now glared through narrowed eyes, distrusting even his most faithful companions. One of the most chilling aspects of this transformation was his growing obsession with betrayal. He saw treachery everywhere, in whispered conversations, in innocent glances, in long-standing friendships. He ordered the surveillance of his court, recruited informants, and demanded absolute loyalty. The Tower of London, once rarely used, became a frequent destination for those who displeased him. Executions multiplied. Among the most shocking was the fate of Thomas More, his former friend and Lord Chancellor. More had been a mentor to Henry in earlier years, a brilliant humanist and theologian. But when More refused to support Henry's break from the Catholic Church, the king had him imprisoned, tried for treason, and beheaded. It was a loss not just of a man, but of a moral compass. Henry no longer tolerated disagreement, only submission. And then came Thomas Cromwell, the architect of the English Reformation, the very man who had helped Henry gain control of the Church of England. Cromwell, loyal and strategic, had done the king's bidding time and again. But after arranging Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, a union the king detested, Cromwell fell from favor. In 1540, Henry ordered his execution. Just weeks later, he reportedly expressed regret. This was the essence of late-stage Henry: capricious, impulsive, and deeply insecure. His court lived in constant fear. One wrong word, one misstep, one poorly timed opinion could end in arrest or death. Even his wives were not safe. Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard were beheaded. Catherine of Aragon was banished. Jane Seymour died in childbirth. Anne of Cleves was cast aside. Only Catherine Parr would survive him. The king's paranoia was most evident in his rituals around food. Terrified of being poisoned, he created elaborate safeguards. Servants were required to taste every dish before it reached him. All utensils were inspected. His kitchens were guarded like fortresses. Food preparation became a militarized process, as if the king were under siege at every meal. Henry also became increasingly obsessed with secrecy. He limited his public appearances, avoided large gatherings, and surrounded himself with yes-men. He no longer trusted diplomats, clergy, or even his own children. Mary and Elizabeth were both declared illegitimate at different points, depending on whom he favored or disfavored. The line of succession became a game of shifting alliances rather than a clear policy. The once confident and strategic ruler now seemed to govern from a place of anxiety. He second-guessed treaties, reversed policies, and punished advisors for outcomes they could not control. His correspondence became erratic, sometimes contradictory. Orders were issued in haste, retracted days later, then reinstated. Ministers scrambled to keep up, and yet no one dared confront him. His anger was volcanic. He could erupt over trivial matters: a poorly tied shoelace, a misplaced seal, a rumor whispered in passing. His punishments were often theatrical, designed not just to remove opposition, but to terrify the survivors. This was no longer just a king, it was a man imprisoned by his own demons. The psychological collapse of Henry VIII transformed England's government into an echo chamber, his policies into paranoia, and his court into a theater of dread. Royal decrees became expressions of fear rather than vision. Power once held with purpose was now wielded in desperation. It is a chilling reminder of what happens when absolute authority is combined with chronic pain, unprocessed trauma, and unchecked delusion. In the final decade of his life, Henry VIII ceased to be a ruler of men and became a ruler ruled by fear. To understand the personal unraveling of Henry VIII is to examine the wreckage of his marriage's 6 unions that together form a tragic map of his emotional desperation, dynastic obsession, and moral decay. As his body faltered and his mind grew erratic, Henry's relationships with women grew more transactional, more destructive, and more revealing of the man he had become. When we picture royal romance, we think of grandeur, courtship, and alliance. But for Henry, love had always been entangled with duty, power, and legacy. And by the time of his 5th and 6th marriages, love had become something grotesque, a theater of dominance, insecurity, and fear. After the death of Jane Seymour in 1537, the only wife to give him a male heir, Henry plunged into mourning. Jane was quiet, obedient, and non-threatening. Her passing seemed to freeze the last remnants of tenderness in him. He later referred to her as his true wife and requested to be buried beside her. In truth, it was Jane's ability to produce Edward, not any deeper passion, that secured her posthumous veneration. By the late 1530s, Henry was desperate again, not just for heirs, but for youth, virility, and the illusion of control. In 1540, he married Anne of Cleves, a political match orchestrated by his advisor Thomas Cromwell to secure an alliance with German Protestants. But Henry, now bloated and ailing, found Anne unattractive. He claimed she smelled poorly, had sagging breasts, and lacked sophistication. The marriage was never consummated. He annulled it within 6 months and turned on Cromwell, having him executed for treason. Thus, a failed wedding became a death sentence and a warning to others. Then came Catherine Howard. She was everything Anne of Cleves was not: young, flirtatious, full of life. Barely 19, Catherine was a distant cousin of Anne Boleyn, and like her cousin, she caught the king's eye with beauty and charm. But this was no romantic tale. By this time, Henry was nearly 50, morbidly obese, and stinking with infection. He could barely walk. His leg ulcers bled and reeked. The contrast between the youthful bride and the decaying groom could not have been more striking. Yet Henry believed, or needed to believe, that Catherine Howard brought him back to life. He lavished her with gifts, affection, and praise. He called her his rose without a thorn. Court poets were commissioned to immortalize their love. For a moment the king basked in the illusion of vitality, but Catherine did not share his fantasy. Isolated, watched, and subjected to the grotesque attentions of a diseased king, she sought comfort in secret meetings with Thomas Culpeper, a young and handsome courtier. The risk was enormous, but perhaps the loneliness, fear, and emotional suffocation were even greater. When the affair was discovered, the response was swift and merciless. Henry, humiliated and furious, became a volcano of grief and rage. Catherine was arrested, interrogated, and ultimately beheaded in 1542. She was only about 21. It was said she asked for the executioner's block the night before to practice laying her head upon it. The execution of Catherine Howard was not just the end of a failed marriage. It was a brutal punctuation mark on Henry's attempt to reclaim his youth. The message was clear: betrayal would not be tolerated, no matter how frail or sickly the betrayed. Then came his final wife, Catherine Parr. Unlike her predecessors, Catherine Parr was wise, politically astute, and deeply religious. She had already been married twice and was in her 30s, mature by Tudor standards. She did not marry for romance, but for survival and perhaps duty. She became a caretaker more than a queen, nursing the king through his infections, tending to his fevers, reading scripture aloud when he was too weak to speak. Catherine Parr walked a careful line. She engaged in theological discussions with Henry, even publishing devotional texts, but she also knew how to retreat when necessary. When she was accused by enemies of heresy for her Protestant leanings, she skillfully deflected the charge by appearing penitent and obedient, thus avoiding the fate of Anne and Catherine Howard. She outlived Henry, but her time as his queen was marked not by love, but by the exhausting task of tending to a man who was falling apart physically, emotionally, and spiritually. By the time of his death, Henry had married 6 women and broken nearly all of them. 2 were executed, 2 cast aside, 1 died in childbirth, and 1 barely survived. His pursuit of love and legacy left a trail of corpses, betrayals, and regrets. These marriages, especially in his later life, reveal the contours of Henry's decline more clearly than any medical record. Each bride reflected something he was losing: youth control, legitimacy, affection. And each ending reinforced his isolation. For a man so obsessed with legacy, love became his greatest failure. By the winter of 1546, the once mighty King Henry VIII was no longer a ruler in command of his court or even of his own body. He was a specter of his former self, bedridden, blistered, bloated, and decaying from the inside out. The sovereign of England, whose word had once reshaped the continent's religious landscape, could barely speak. His leg ulcers had grown so deep and infected that witnesses claimed bone was visible through the rotting flesh. The putrid smell was so overpowering that courtiers kept perfumed cloths under their noses and tried to mask their nausea with forced expressions of reverence. The winter air did not help. Cold and damp, it cut through the stone walls of the palace and aggravated his wounds. The king's apartments were kept heated with roaring fire, but the warmth seemed only to amplify the sickly odor of decomposition. At this point, Henry could no longer mount a horsewalk unaided, or even rise from bed without the help of pulleys and a team of servants. His weight had surpassed 400 pounds and his limbs were swollen with fluid. Gangrene had set in. Every movement was agony. His body, once considered an emblem of virility and strength, had become a prison. Medical care remained as primitive and brutal as ever. The king was subjected to frequent bloodlettings, the application of poultices made of mustard and pitch, and cauterization procedures that often left him screaming in torment. His physicians, terrified of losing royal favor, dared not admit that the treatments were ineffective or, worse, hastening his death. Worse still was the political climate within the court. English law made it treason to predict the monarch's death. Even as Henry's skin turned ashen and his speech became slurred, no one dared speak of his condition in honest terms. Instead, an elaborate theater of optimism unfolded around his bed. Courtiers made public declarations of the king's resilience. Physicians offered reassurances that he simply needed rest. Official documents were drafted as if the king would soon return to full strength. In private, however, the reality was bleak. Henry slipped in and out of delirium. His mind, ravaged by fever and perhaps minor strokes, became a haunted palace of regrets. He reportedly called out the names of his deceased wives, Jane Seymour, most often the mother of his only legitimate son. But there were also whispers in the corridors that he murmured the name Anne Boleyn, the woman he had sent to the scaffold in a haze of paranoia and vengeance. Those present during these final weeks described a man tormented, not only by disease but by memory. His screams could be heard down the hall. His mutterings were often incoherent, sometimes venomous. He cried out against imagined traitors, relived battles from decades earlier, and drifted into long spells of silence, where his face contorted with unseen visions. Paranoia never left him. Meals were still tasted by servants. Guards monitored every visitor. Even his closest aides were watched. His once celebrated court had become a tomb of secrecy and dread. By January 27, 1547, the end could no longer be denied. He was incoherent, slipping toward unconsciousness. The decision was finally made to summon Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, a trusted religious figure, and the spiritual architect of Henry's break with Rome. When Cranmer arrived, Henry could no longer speak. The Archbishop leaned close and asked the king if he died in the faith of Christ. Henry squeezed his hand in affirmation. It was his last conscious act. In the early hours of January 28, 1547, Henry VIII died at the age of 55. There was no grand final proclamation, no farewell address to his kingdom, no moment of redemptive clarity. He died as he had lived in his final years, isolated, swollen with power and disease, surrounded by whispers and shadows. But his death, while expected, left England in a state of profound uncertainty. His only male heir, Edward VI, was just 9 years old and sickly. The religious upheaval Henry had triggered was unfinished. The fates of his daughters Mary and Elizabeth remained unresolved. The realm had been shaped in his image, and now that image lay broken and decomposing in a royal bed in Whitehall Palace. It would take weeks before his death was officially announced. The silence, the denial, the fear of the vacuum he left behind, all of it, spoke to the strange and terrifying power that Henry VIII had amassed over his lifetime. Even in death, he ruled through intimidation. The long agony of his final months was not just a physical ordeal. It was a symbolic undoing, a king consumed by his own body, betrayed by the very flesh that had once made him great. One might expect that the death of one of the most powerful monarchs in English history would be marked by dignity, grandeur, and solemn reverence. But for Henry VIII, death brought not triumph, but further humiliation. In life, he had been feared and obeyed without question. In death, his body would become an object of revulsion, his remains a symbol of grotesque decline. After his passing in the early hours of January 28, 1547, there was no immediate announcement. Fear of political instability loomed. England had been ruled with a heavy centralized hand for nearly 4 decades, and now it was leaderless. The young heir, Edward VI, was just 9 years old and unprepared to govern. Advisors scrambled to maintain a semblance of control while preparing for the inevitable public mourning. The king's corpse, however, had no such patience. Henry's body, bloated by years of obesity and riddled with infection, began to decay rapidly. Embalming in the Tudor era was a crude process. The internal organs were hastily removed and packed with aromatic herbs, such as lavender and rosemary. The cavities were stuffed with linen, soaked in spices, but the sheer mass of Henry's body presented an unprecedented challenge. The embalmers could not adequately preserve him. A massive lead-lined coffin was commissioned to contain the smell and fluids. Even this was insufficient. The coffin was first taken to Whitehall Palace, where it was laid in state. From there it began the slow procession to Windsor Castle, where the king was to be buried beside Jane Seymour, his beloved third wife. Along the way, the coffin was placed overnight in the chapel of Sion Abbey, a former monastic house now converted into a royal lodging. And it was there that the most macabre moment of Henry's posthumous journey occurred. According to the chronicler Edward Hall, during the night at Sion Abbey, the coffin began to leak. The bodily fluids from the decomposing king seeped through the poorly sealed seams of the casket. A foul black fluid oozed onto the chapel floor. It is said that stray dogs wandered into the chapel and began to lick up the discharge. It is difficult to verify the literal truth of this account, but whether fact or allegory, the symbolism was damning. Here was the body of a king who had once styled himself as God's anointed defier of popes, destroyer of monasteries, now reduced to putrefaction and consumed by vermin. The story circulated widely, and for many it became the defining image of his demise, the mighty Henry, violated in death, desecrated not by enemies, but by the inevitability of decay. 3 weeks after his death on February 16th, Henry VIII was finally buried. The ceremony was grand and choreographed to perfection. Nobles wept. Heralds chanted his titles. Trumpets rang through the vaulted chambers of St. George's Chapel at Windsor. Yet those closest to the corpse could barely tolerate the stench. He was laid to rest in a vault beneath the choir of the chapel next to Jane Seymour, the wife who had given him his only legitimate son. There was no elaborate tomb erected immediately. The magnificent black marble sarcophagus Henry had once intended for himself had ironically been appropriated by another ruler, Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell, nearly a century later. For decades, Henry's grave remained largely unmarked, a modest slab covering the remains of a man who had dominated his era. It was as if England, while unwilling to speak ill of a king, was also unsure how to honor him. The leaking coffin, the perfumed cloths, the delay in burial, all of it paints a portrait of a ruler whose death was as grotesque as it was symbolic. The final humiliation did not come from rebellion or assassination, but from nature itself. His body, swollen with excess, turned on him as if exacting revenge for a lifetime of indulgence and tyranny. Even in the sanctity of death, Henry could not command respect from the forces that govern all flesh. Decay does not recognize rank. Putrefaction does not bow to crowns. And so beneath the stone floor of Windsor, wrapped in velvet and herbs, lay the remains of a man once considered divine, oozing rotting, and silently proving that no throne can defy the grave. Henry VIII's horrific demise is not a historical anomaly, it is part of a larger haunting pattern. Across history, absolute rulers have often met not noble ends, but ones marked by indignity, isolation, and physical torment. When power is wielded without limit, and when rulers believe themselves invincible, the fall when it comes is often gruesome. And in this, Henry VIII was far from alone. Consider Ivan IV of Russia, better known as Ivan the Terrible. Like Henry Ivan was a deeply intelligent ruler who began with ambitious reforms, but over time he descended into paranoia, religious fanaticism, and sadism. He created the Oprichnina, a personal guard and secret police force that terrorized his subjects. He murdered his own son in a fit of rage. His death fittingly was sudden and grotesque. He collapsed while playing chess, convulsing violently in front of his court. Some say he was poisoned, others suggest a stroke. Either way, the man who had terrorized an empire died alone, foaming at the mouth. Or take Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator who ruled the USSR with an iron grip for nearly 30 years. Like Henry, Stalin trusted no one. He purged his own allies, exiled generals, and lived in fear of assassination. When Stalin suffered a massive stroke in 1953, his guards found him hours later collapsed on the floor of his dacha, partially paralyzed and covered in urine. They had been too afraid to disturb him earlier. He lingered for days, unable to speak, conscious but helpless. Ministers debated who would take power, while their supreme leader lay dying within earshot. In his final hours, Stalin reportedly raised his arm in terror toward the ceiling as if seeing something horrific. He died not as the father of a nation, but as a broken, twitching man surrounded by silence and dread. Closer to Henry's era was Charles VIII, Roman emperor, his one-time rival and fellow European titan. Charles voluntarily abdicated in 1556, retreating to a monastery in Spain, where he spent his last years contemplating death. Unlike Henry, Charles accepted his mortality. But even he was not spared decay. He suffered from gout so severe he could barely walk, and was buried in a simple wooden coffin, despite ruling over one of the largest empires in history. Why do so many powerful rulers end this way? Because power isolates. It silences dissent. It removes the checks and balances that might force a person to face uncomfortable truths about their health, their behavior, or their mortality. Henry VIII, like these others, surrounded himself with flatterers who told him what he wanted to hear. His doctors did not challenge his diet. His ministers did not question his paranoia. His wives were not permitted to speak freely, and those who did were executed. In the end, he was a man imprisoned by the very power he believed would free him. Moreover, absolute authority often leads to absolute indulgence. Rulers like Henry and Stalin consumed beyond measure food, drink, resources, even people. Their physical decline was not merely biological but symbolic. It reflected the internal rot that came from decades of excess and unchecked ego. What ties these deaths together is not just their grotesqueness, but their symbolism. Each ruler died not just of disease, but of the corrosive nature of their own rule. Their bodies failed in the same way their empires faltered slowly, painfully, and amid whispers rather than declarations. Their final moments stripped away the illusion of grandeur and revealed the raw, inescapable truth of human frailty. And so Henry IV, with his leaking coffin and ulcerated legs, joins this grim fellowship. His death is not merely a footnote of the Tudor dynasty, it is part of a broader narrative that shows us how absolute power can corrode not only nations, but the very bodies and souls of those who wield it. It's one thing to chronicle Henry VIII's visible decline, the ulcers, the obesity, the paranoia, but to fully understand his downfall, we must examine what may have been happening beneath the surface. Modern medicine, centuries more advanced than the rudimentary treatments of Tudor England, allows us to reevaluate Henry not just as a historical figure, but as a complex medical case study. Henry's symptoms were extensive and interconnected: extreme weight gain, persistent leg ulcers, chronic pain, mood swings, erratic behavior, infertility, cognitive decline, and possible strokes. Each symptom contributed to the others, creating a cycle of deterioration. And each one influenced the choices he made as king, from his marriages to his policies, and most terrifyingly, his executions. Let's start with the most visible change: his obesity. Henry's weight gain was dramatic and unprecedented for a monarch of his time. By the 1540s, his waist exceeded 54 inches, and his weight may have reached 400 pounds. Such obesity would have placed enormous strain on his cardiovascular system. Today, doctors would likely diagnose morbid obesity with complications like congestive heart failure, type 2 diabetes, sleep apnea, and chronic venous insufficiency, all of which contribute to fatigue, irritability, cognitive fog, and depression. His infamous ulcers, which began after the 1536 jousting accident, may have been more than just external wounds. Many experts believe he suffered from osteomyelitis, a severe bone infection, or even deep venous thrombosis, where clots form in deep veins due to inactivity. These conditions would have made walking excruciating and healing virtually impossible in a time without antibiotics. Add to this the ineffective and harmful treatments of the era hot iron, cauterization, mercury salves, and bloodletting, and we see how medicine did not help him heal, but rather amplified his suffering. But the physical symptoms are only half the story. Psychologically, Henry's transformation from charming prince to tyrant has long intrigued historians. Some blame his environment, his absolute power, his dynastic pressure, the loss of male heirs, but modern psychology suggests deeper roots. Many believe Henry suffered from narcissistic personality disorder, characterized by grandiosity, a need for admiration, and a lack of empathy. Early in his reign, these traits may have been masked by his charisma and competence. But as his health declined and challenges to his authority grew, the narcissism hardened into cruelty and paranoia. He also showed signs of borderline personality features, including black and white thinking, intense fears of abandonment, and a pattern of unstable relationships. His pattern of cycling through wives, idolizing them, then destroying them when they failed to meet expectations, is a classic behavioral marker. Adding to the complexity is the 1536 head trauma. Contemporary accounts say Henry was unconscious for 2 hours after the fall. Today, we understand that such a prolonged blackout likely indicates a traumatic brain injury, TBI. This kind of injury to the frontal lobe, the seat of decision-making, impulse control, and emotional regulation, can result in long-term behavioral changes, including impulsiveness, irritability, and even violence. This may explain why, after 1536, Henry became increasingly erratic, executing ministers who had served him loyally, suspecting his own wives of treason, and lashing out against perceived slights. While such behavior may have once been interpreted purely as authoritarian excess, it now looks eerily consistent with TBI-related dysfunction. He also likely suffered from major depressive disorder, especially in his later years. The loss of mobility, the inability to produce a second male heir, The deaths of beloved companions like Jane Seymour all contributed to a man trapped not just in a broken body, but in a profoundly broken spirit. He isolated himself, avoided court appearances, and was frequently described as melancholic and withdrawn. All of this took place in a time where mental health was not understood. There was no concept of psychiatric diagnosis, no therapy, no antidepressants, no pain management beyond herbal concoctions and crude surgery. Henry's behavior, increasingly erratic and violent, was treated as divine will or worse, as a reflection of his enemy's treachery. In reality, it may have been the desperate flailing of a man consumed by illness, trapped by his own legend, and failed by the medicine of his time. Modern hindsight offers no cure, but it provides understanding. It allows us to see Henry VIII not just as a tyrant, but as a man suffering physically, emotionally, and psychologically. It does not excuse his cruelty, but it does explain its origins. Power can distort a man, pain can destroy him, and Henry VIII, for all his titles and power, was no exception. Henry VIII died in 1547, but his legacy has never been laid to rest. His life ended in pain, obesity, paranoia, and decay, but he left behind a kingdom forever transformed. Few monarchs in history have reshaped a nation so drastically. Fewer still have done so with such personal contradictions. He was a devout Christian who defied the Pope, a man obsessed with male heirs whose true legacy was carried forward by daughters, a ruler who dismantled centuries of religious tradition, yet left behind no clear spiritual consensus. In every sense, Henry's legacy is as conflicted and complex as the man himself. At the time of his death, England was unstable. The monarchy passed to his only surviving son, Edward VI, a boy of just 9 years old. The realm would now be governed by regents, and religious battles raged behind the scenes. Henry's reformation was incomplete, his religious policies inconsistent. He had dissolved monasteries broken with Rome, executed both Catholic traditionalists and Protestant reformers. His England had no doctrinal anchor, only the residue of royal will. Edward's reign would last just 6 years. The boy king, pale and sickly, died at the age of 15 from illness. Henry's greatest anxiety that the Tudor line would falter was becoming reality. The irony was staggering. The man who had defied the Vatican, broken marriages, and executed wives for the sake of a male heir had sired a son who would not live to adulthood. After Edward came Mary, first Henry's daughter, with Catherine of Aragon. A devout Catholic, she attempted to undo her father's reforms, restore papal authority, and purge England of Protestantism. Her reign became infamous for the Marian persecutions, during which hundreds of Protestants were burned at the stake. Mary's reign, though short, further deepened the religious divides Henry had opened and earned her the nickname Bloody Mary. It was only with the accession of Elizabeth, Sir Henry's daughter, by Anne Boleyn, that the Tudor dynasty found stability. Elizabeth reigned for 45 years, ushering in the English Renaissance, defeating the Spanish Armada, and uniting a fractured nation. Ironically, the greatest fruits of Henry's lineage came through the daughter of the woman he had executed, an ultimate contradiction in the twisted saga of his personal life. In Elizabeth, the traits that had made Henry both admired and feared, strength, decisiveness, charisma, were honed and refined. She avoided marriage, perhaps wary of her father's legacy. She relied on clever ministers, but ruled as her own sovereign. She learned from his excesses and governed with restraint. In a way, her reign served as a correction to his. But Henry's legacy extends beyond dynastic outcomes. The English Reformation, though erratic during his life, permanently severed the Church of England from Roman Catholic authority. The monarch became the head of the church, a theological shift with enormous implications for the future of British politics, law, and society. This ecclesiastical independence eventually fed into larger ideas of national sovereignty, and centuries later into British constitutional development. The economic effects of his dissolution of the monasteries were equally massive. By seizing church lands and redistributing them to nobles, Henry shifted wealth and power away from the ecclesiastical elite and laid the foundation for a new English aristocracy. Yet this action also destabilized local economies, led to widespread social unrest, and unleashed a long-term identity crisis about what England was: Catholic, Protestant, monarchist, reformist. And finally, there is the cultural legacy, one that looms far beyond the history books. Henry VIII has become one of the most recognized monarchs in the world, not because of peace treaties or great victories, but because of his drama. 6 wives, 2 beheadings, a new church, a leaking coffin. He has become a symbol of both royal power and royal madness. Shakespeare would write of kings whose minds were undone by ambition and guilt. But Henry's true tragedy is not that he was misunderstood. It's that he was understood too well. He was a man of appetites, political, sexual, theological, and culinary. And those appetites ultimately devoured him. Today we remember Henry VIII not as a wise statesman, nor as a cruel villain alone, but as something more disturbing, a mirror for how power corrupts, how fear isolates, and how the human body, no matter how mighty the man within, always has the final word. His tomb at St. George's Chapel in Windsor remains understated. No towering statue, no glowing epitaph. Just a slab of stone beneath which rests a king who changed the world and was destroyed by the very forces he unleashed. In the end, all kings fall. Henry VIII, once the most dazzling monarch in Christendom, died not on a battlefield or amid the cheers of a grateful nation, but rotting in his bed, abandoned by health, haunted by ghosts, and consumed by the very appetites that had once made him great. He was a man who spent his life defying limitations, papal authority, religious tradition, political counsel, even marital law. He dissolved ancient institutions with a signature. He declared himself God's chosen ruler on earth. He believed that he could rewrite the rules of inheritance, of theology, of history itself. But there was one force he could not conquer: mortality. Henry's death, bloated, ulcerated, leaking, reeking, was more than just the end of a man. It was the shattering of a myth. In a world that believed kings were ordained by heaven, Henry's body betrayed that illusion. His decomposition began before he had even drawn his last breath. His corpse bled through a royal coffin. Stray dogs licked the fluids of a man who once struck terror into the hearts of popes. Such imagery is not merely grotesque, it is symbolic. It tells us something essential about human power, that it is temporary, conditional, and in the face of time and biology, meaningless. The flesh does not care for crowns. Disease does not heed royal decrees. Pain humbles even the most arrogant soul. Henry's decline is not just a medical history, it is a moral fable. His body mirrored his reign, once majestic, now bloated. Once admired, now feared. Once full of promise, now filled with rot. The public grandeur was a mask. Behind the tapestries, in the privacy of his chambers, the king was reduced to something deeply human, fragile, frightened, and finite. And yet this final chapter is what makes Henry VIII's story endure. It is not merely his triumphs, the break with Rome, the formation of the Church of England, the centralization of power that captivate us. It is the contrast, the dissonance, the fall. We are drawn to kings not because they are gods, but because they remind us of ourselves. We see in Henry the brilliance of youth and the cruelty of pride, the hunger for love and the terror of failure. We see the man who had everything: wealth, armies, adoration, and still ended up alone, sick and gasping for air. The leaking coffin, the perfumed courtiers, the prayers whispered too late, all of it reveals a truth: no crown can shield us from death is the final equalizer. And so Henry VIII becomes more than a historical figure. He becomes a symbol of what happens when power is unchecked, of what it means to outlive one's glory, of what remains when the pageantry fades and the last anthem has been sung. He rewrote the laws of his land, but he could not rewrite the laws of nature. He severed England from the Pope, but he could not sever himself from the grave. He silenced dissenters, but he could not silence the decay that crept into his bones. In the end, he was not Henry the Magnificent, or Henry the Glorious, or Henry the Beloved. He was Henry the Mortal. And for all his towering accomplishments and terrible sins, that is the title he could never escape.